Now, with the conditional content covered here, before we continue, I want to restructure the expenses component a little bit. And I actually want to extract that list logic into a new component to again make that expenses component a little bit leaner. Therefore, I'll add a expenses list.js file and also a expenses list.css file, which you also find attached. And you can already download my CSS file and copy the styles into your expenses list CSS file. In the expenses list.js file, I will then add a constant expenses list, which receives props and returns something. And of course, we export this expenses list. And we can, if we want to, also import React from React, but again, that is optional. Now here in expenses list, I want to output my expenses list. I will not filter in there. I will keep the filtering logic in expenses, since that's also where I manage the filtered year. But I will take this fallback content, this if check, I will take all of that and move that into my expenses list component. That means that we also, of course, want to import the expense item from /expense item here, since I'm using that component here. And the filtered expenses no longer exist here. I just want to get, let's say, my items here, or expenses. It's up to you. I'll name it items as props, like this. Now in expenses.js, that of course means that here I now want to output my expenses list down there. And of course, we therefore also want to import expenses list from the expenses list file. And we can get rid of the expense item import. And the filtered expenses should now be passed to expenses list through the items prop, which I'm using inside of expenses list, like this. Now, inside of the expenses list.js file, I also want to make a couple of changes now. Of course, we need to return some JSX, but I want to return an unordered list here and actually give that list a class name of expenses-list. This is a class defined here in my CSS file, and therefore we also want to import this expenses list CSS file into the expenses list.js file. And inside of this unordered list, I now want to output my map here, my expense item array. So I will again grab that and render this dynamically here like this. And I will handle this if case a little bit differently now. I will add a if check, but I'll check if props items length is equal to 0. So if we have no items, and if that's the case, I will simply return a totally different JSX snippet, because that's yet another way of handling conditional content. If what your component returns changes entirely based on different conditions, you can use this approach. It would have not been appropriate here in expenses.js before, because only a part of the JSX snippet which we returned changed. So there, the approach I showed in the last lecture was better. But if your entire JSX content changes when data is missing, you can also add a if check where you return a different JSX block if some condition is met. And here I simply want to return an h2 tag with a class name of expenses-list __ fallback with a text of found no expenses. So that's what this component, expenses list, will render if we got no expenses. Hence, we can also get rid of that variable here. And with that, we see this found no expenses text or the filtered list if we switch. But now, with help of this extra component, which uses a different logic for rendering or for returning different JSX code, and we now also got a little bit of a leaner expenses.js file again. Now, one additional tweak which I want to make here, which I almost forgot, is that since I'm using an unordered list here now, for semantic reasons in the expense item component, I actually want to switch away from having a div being rendered to a list item instead. So I will just wrap this entire card here with a list item. And visually, this doesn't change anything, but semantically, this is a little bit better. So that's just another tiny tweak which I wanted to make here.